Great. My name is Mark Lowry. I'm the Assistant Director of the Office of Climate Change at the State Department of Environmental Conservation. We seem to have a theme here of starting in detail and working our way out, zooming out, as it were. And you've heard David talk a little bit about the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. I will do the same, and I will try to avoid as much overlap as I can, but there will be some. But in line with that theme of zooming out, I usually start these presentations with talking a little bit about the global context of why New York State actually has embarked on this journey to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. And I won't go into a lot of detail on that for this particular audience, because I suspect everyone in this audience understands the need for the globe to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. But in answer to some folks who have commented recently that anything New York State, or for that matter, the U.S. does with regard to emissions won't matter. New York State's greenhouse gas emissions represent about 0.5% of the total global emissions, but our per capita emissions are several times greater than those of all but a very few other inhabitants of nations on the earth, including those of India and China. So it is important for the state of New York to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions for long-term benefits. But it's also clear that we will be dealing with the substantial climatic change and its effects, regardless of what we do now to reduce emissions. So we are going to have to, as a state and as a nation, make investments to reduce our emissions while simultaneously preparing for the effects of climate change. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Now, you've already seen a version of this slide, and I won't repeat it. David already went into more detail than I had planned to anyway. But I would say that mentioned that the Climate Act does not detail an emissions reduction plan. The detail that David talked about largely does not really come from the act itself, but from the implementing plans that are being put in place. The Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, or the Climate Act, envisions an overall strategy of beneficial electrification of the entire state economy, empowering that efficient electrified economy with clean sources of power, as David described. In support of this strategy, the law requires the Department of Public Service to undertake proceedings to ensure large investments in renewable energy and energy efficiency, again, as David detailed. But the law also requires that investments in disadvantaged communities be prioritized and that support be provided to individuals and communities that are currently dependent on fossil fuel industries. The statute actually charges DEC with having the primary regulatory role in limiting greenhouse gas emissions, although other agencies may also issue supporting regulations with the CLCPA, the Climate Act, as their authority to do so. These agency regulations, particularly those of DEC, are to be guided by a scoping plan that is in turn to be developed by a Climate Action Council. The scoping plan must also be reflected in the first state energy plan to be issued after the completion of the scoping plan. The Climate Action Council, which is meeting as we speak, comprises 22 appointees, with the president of NYSERDA, David's boss, and my boss, the commissioner of DEC, serving as the co-chairs. Pursuant to the statute, the council appointed 7 advisory panels to make recommendations for greenhouse gas reductions in each of the 7 major emission sectors. And I'll mention that I was appointed to the Land Use and Local Government Advisory Panel. All the recommendations made by these 7 advisory panels that had been approved by the council have now been embodied in a draft scoping plan, which the council released pursuant to the act for public comment on December 30th of 2021. And I'll talk about the scoping plan in a little detail, more detail in a moment. But I also want to point out for members of this audience an important section of the CLCPA that's often overlooked. what we refer to as the Section 7. Section 7 of the CLCPA requires all state agencies to reduce their operational emissions, a lead by example kind of thing. But more significantly, Section 7 also requires all state agencies in considering any action, whether it's issuing a permit, establishing a policy, issuing a license, whatever, to determine the consistency of that action with the greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements of the Climate Act. DEC has already used this requirement as the basis for denying 2 permits to repower existing power plants. These denials are now the subject of appeals in court, but those were examples for how DEC intends to use this new requirement of the law to ensure that that actions that it takes, such as issuing a permit, do reflect the requirements of the CLCPA. Getting back to the scoping plan and the overall process, under this law, the Climate Action Council's final scoping plan is due before January 1st of 2023. And then DEC has 1 more year to promulgate the regulations to achieve the required emission reductions, again, guided by that scoping plan. We had a slow start due to COVID, but we still have the original statutory deadlines to meet. We've received no dispensation from the governor or the legislature on meeting the very tight deadlines that are in the law. The council first met in March of 2020, and later that year, the 7 advisory panels began development of their recommendations, including extensive public consultation on those recommendations. The advisory panels presented their recommendations to the council in the spring and early summer of 2021, and staff began preparing the draft scoping plan as consensus formed within the council around the recommendations that would be included in the draft scoping plan. As I mentioned, the council released its draft scoping plan on December 30th of 2021. Officially, the public comment period opened on January 1st of 2022 and ran through June 10th of 2022. And that public comment opportunity included 11 public hearings, including, I believe, 2 virtual hearings. In parallel to the council's process, and in addition to supporting the council in addition to supporting the council, state agency staff have completed several other required milestones, including the Public Services Commission adoption of an updated clean energy standard to require 70% renewable sources of electricity by 2030. DEC and NYSERDA have issued a report on barriers to clean energy and adaptation resources and opportunities to overcome those barriers in disadvantaged communities in December 2021, as required by the law. And DEC has also finalized and released guidance on the use of social cost of carbon, the required regulation setting the 2030 and 2050 greenhouse gas emission limits, and a regulation limiting certain end uses of hydrofluorocarbons. And as required by the law, DEC issued a greenhouse gas emissions report at the end of 2021. And I mentioned this reflects a change in the law. Prior to the law's enactment, NYSERDA took the lead on issuing the state's greenhouse gas emissions report. The law puts that responsibility back on DEC, particularly my office. But based on this report, which again was released at the end of last year, we can see the enormity of the challenge our state faces, as illustrated by the bar graph on the right. Reducing the state's greenhouse gas emissions from about 375 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent to about 61 million metric tons over the next 30 years or so. The inner ring of the circular graph indicates the relative proportions represented by our major emission sectors, and the outer ring, the contribution of sources within each of these sectors. We point this out because understanding the current sources of emissions can help us understand the selection of strategies that have been included in the draft scoping plan. Although many people tend to think of power plants as the major cause of climate change, in New York, they represent only about 13% of our total greenhouse gas emissions. As many of you know, in New York State, the transportation sector at 28% and buildings at 32% represent much larger sources of emissions. These building emissions are primarily the result of combustion of fossil fuels to heat space and water, for drying clothes, and for cooking, and HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons released from building equipment and foam insulation. Waste management, which includes methane emissions from landfills and wastewater treatment plants, sits at about 12% and is responsible for almost as much greenhouse gas emissions in the state as power generation. Agriculture is an important but relatively small portion of our state's emissions at about 6%. The Council's planning has been informed by analysis performed by NYSERDA to integrate all the advisory panel recommendations to assess their likely total effects on greenhouse gas emissions, as well as their costs and benefits. This analysis included a reference case based on business as usual, plus greenhouse gas reduction policies that were already in place, which showed that the current policies would not bring us close to achieving the required emission reductions. Analysis also included a scenario 1, which included all the recommendations as presented by those 7 advisory panels I mentioned. However, this analysis indicated that all those panel recommendations together would not be sufficient to achieve the required emission reductions, which is why we're not even showing scenario 1 on this slide, which is available at climate.ny.gov. Having determined that the advisory panel recommendations as they were presented would not achieve the required emission reductions, the Council went back to the drawing board and developed the 3 action scenarios depicted here, all of which would be expected to achieve the required reductions under the law. This figure does represent a comparison among these 3 action scenarios, 2, 3, and 4, as presented in the draft scoping plan. The figure is available again at climate.ny.gov for anyone wishes to review it, and I won't have no intention of reviewing it in detail now, but I will try to provide an overview of the 3 action scenarios. It's important to understand, however, that none of these scenarios represents a specific plan or recommendation, but they are intended to show the range of options that are available to decision makers and on which the council is discussing at the moment. All 3 action scenarios include in common certain foundational strategies in the power generation, transportation, agriculture, and waste sectors. All have a heavy emphasis on rapid electrification and gains in energy efficiency that must be achieved if we are to achieve the required greenhouse gas emission reductions. But the 3 scenarios do provide for different approaches for reducing emissions from some sources. All scenarios include zero emissions electricity generation by 2040 as required by the statute, but also, as David alluded to, full electrification of buildings and transportation, aggressive action to reduce vehicle miles traveled, a transition to low global warming potential refrigerants, and elimination of fugitive methane emissions. In general, the 3 action scenarios differ somewhat in their use of low carbon fuels derived from biomass and green hydrogen versus an accelerated transition away from all combustion, and in the pace with which some policies are implemented, particularly reduction of vehicle miles traveled and reduction of methane emissions. Scenarios 2 and 3 differ in that scenario 2 includes use of low carbon fuels derived from that biomass and green hydrogen, especially in applications that will be difficult to electrify. While scenario 3 includes an accelerated transition away from all combustion with more aggressive building and transportation electrification than is assumed in scenario 2. Scenario 4 would include more limited use of low carbon fuels while accelerating implementation of policies intended to drive electrification, reduction of VMT, and more rapid reduction of methane emissions. Among the most important findings of the integration analysis is that the level of required decarbonization to comply with the greenhouse gas emission limits in the law is feasible, but will require aggressive action and investment across all emitting sectors. Necessary strategies include deep improvements in energy efficiency across all sectors, but particularly in our buildings. The transition to electrification for heating, water, and space would be implemented primarily through use of high efficiency heat pumps, which David described. To help achieve climate justice and conserve land. The plan also calls for enhanced mass transit, true smart growth, and other strategies to reduce miles traveled in passenger cars and trucks. All three action scenarios include electrification of light-duty vehicles. And again, the governor has already signed legislation that would ban the sale of gas and diesel-powered cars and trucks by 2035. And I understand Washington just enacted legislation that would ban it by 2030. The plan includes strategies to eliminate high global warming potential refrigerants, as well as fugitive methane emissions across the waste, ag, and energy sectors, while maximizing sequestration in New York's lands and forests through land conservation and improved soil and forest management. And the plan includes strategies to develop a diverse portfolio of solutions that will be necessary to electrify industry and improve industry's energy efficiency. We believe that low carbon fuels such as biomass or green hydrogen will likely be necessary in hard to electrify sectors such as aviation, heavy duty vehicles, or high temperature industrial processes. But I will note that some stakeholders oppose reliance on combustion of low carbon fuels, primarily due to the effects they can have on local air quality. With regard to electricity demand, as we replace fossil fuel heating systems with heat pumps, our electrical power demand will transition from a summer peaking system to a winter peaking system, and total electricity demand will grow by 65 to 80% by 2050. The draft scoping plan includes strategies to incorporate statewide load flexibility and controllability into the grid to create a more manageable system. These strategies, plus new and upgraded transmission and distribution systems, will serve to ensure and enhance grid reliability and resilience to extreme weather. In addition, bioenergy or green hydrogen, in addition to that battery storage that David described, will likely be necessary to ensure grid reliability as electrical consumption increases. The draft scoping plan includes strategies to reduce emissions from 6 major emission sectors: transportation, power generation, industry, ag, and forestry, waste, and of course, buildings. The draft scoping plan also includes recommended cross-sector policies for land use, local government, clean energy, and adaptation and resilience. And again, I obviously can't go through the details of the 342-page plan now, even for just the building sector. So I do encourage you to review the draft scoping plan as it stands now, with the understanding that the final plan is under development. Again, that draft scoping plan and thousands of pages of supporting documents are available at climate.ny.gov. I'll just mention, to repeat really what David said, overall, the strategies recommended for the building sector follow the same overall strategy as most of the rest of the plan: deep energy efficiency improvements and a transition away from fossil fuel powered appliances to all electric versions powered with zero emissions electricity. And I will skip this for the sake of time. I'll mention that, of course, there will be costs, but also benefits. And NYSERDA has compared the anticipated economy-wide costs of the 3 action scenarios with the benefits and job creation opportunities of each. And that cost analysis is continuing. In fact, if we were not on this in this conference call, we could listen to presentation to the current Climate Action Council's meeting, where they're getting more information on modeling of costs and benefits that's underway. The council has recommended that additional cost benefit analysis be performed. And again, that analysis is underway and will be included in the final scoping plan. However, the integration analysis performed to date for the council indicates that the net direct cost, that is the incremental investment needed to make this necessary transition over the next 30 years, is a small percentage of our state's $1.7 trillion gross state product. It's less than 1% of our gross state product in 2030 and will be about 1.4% by about 2050. Given the predominance of those foundational strategies I said were common to all three action scenarios examined, the cost and benefits are fairly similar across all three action scenarios. When accounting for both the economic impacts of climate change using DEC social cost and carbon guidance and monetized health benefits, NYSERDA estimates that investments of this relatively small proportion of the state's gross state product, mostly in our buildings and electricity system, would yield net benefits of $90 to $120 billion between now and 2050. This assessment of benefits does not include job creation or economic development opportunities that would come with these investments, but a separate job study projects that overall employment in energy, buildings, and transportation sectors from 2019 through 2050 will increase by at least 268,000 jobs, or a 54% increase in the workforce. The job study also revealed that New York stands to see 10 jobs added in these growing clean energy sectors for every job potentially displaced, such as those in conventional heating or fuel sectors. And the wage profile shows that the largest increase will come in middle wage positions. A large proportion of these net benefits, as estimated by NYSERDA, will be in the form of public health and would apply across all three action scenarios. As we reduce combustion of fossil fuels to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we eliminate our largest source of other pollutants that cause and exacerbate a variety of cardiorespiratory illnesses, particularly among the elderly, children, the urban poor, and outside workers. We also anticipate health benefits associated with efforts to encourage non-motorized transportation. I'm going to close with it by saying that although the council has released its draft scoping plan and the public comment period has closed, the council is continuing to work, meeting monthly or in many cases bi-monthly through the end of this year. The staff, including myself, are currently sorting and reviewing the more than 35,000 comments that we received during the 6-month plus long public comment period. We will be synthesizing those 35,000 comments before making recommendations to the council for any amendments that should be included in the final scoping plan. It's really too early even to summarize the comments precisely. In my read, they are largely supportive of the plan, with many people calling for more aggressive action, but others also voicing concerns about the proposed rate of transition to a clean energy economy, the total cost, the distribution of costs, who's paying for what, and the fate of the current gas infrastructure. Upcoming council meetings through the remainder of this year will include additional discussion of these critical topics, including potential use or abandonment of our current gas infrastructure, potential use of alternative fuels, and how to finance implementation of the plan, including potential carbon pricing. Again, I would invite you to, if you're not already familiar with the material, at climate.ny.gov, take a look at that. Even though the public comment period has closed, the draft scoping plan is there, and again, as well as a voluminous amount of supporting documentation. With that, I will close and take any questions.